All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Cafe Classics Unlocking the Iliad. This is Mod 1 Video 2, where we talk about the significance of Homer. Why study this 2,800-year-old story? Isn't it kind of obsolete? I think the best way to get value out of this story, to get value out of this course, is to begin by understanding at least how influential this story, these characters, these ideas have been across time and across our culture. So I want to begin this video in the same way that I began my book, actually, by going over some quotes. What do other people say about Homer? Plato said that he was the first teacher and the beginner of all these beauties of tragedy. So very high praise, and that was in the Republic, and he actually quotes verbatim Homer at some length. But that's sort of what you might expect. It's a Greek man talking about a Greek story. Not very long afterwards, they hadn't had Shakespeare at that time. Well, we carry on. George Chapman said that Homer's poems were writ from a free fury and absolute and full soul. All Homer's books are such as have been precedents ever since of all sorts of poems, imitating none, nor ever worthily imitated of any. And that was after a great number of other plays and stories have been written. And Homer continued to have an influence throughout Europe, even when they didn't have direct access to Homer's stories. The characters and the events in the Iliad in particular were known through folklore, were known by oral tradition, even without direct access to the text, which is sort of interesting. We'll go into that a little bit later, especially with Hector. G.K. Chesterton, famous Christian writer, this is one of my favorite quotes from it said, "But anyhow, it is true that this, which is our first poem, this being the Iliad, might very well be our last poem too. It might well be the last word as well as the first word spoken by man about his mortal lot as seen by merely mortal vision. If the world becomes pagan and perishes," here pagan means, losing faith, "the last man left alive would do well to quote the Iliad and die." So Homer has been inspiring and influential among intellectuals, academics, artists, and academics in particular have noticed this and have a habit of pointing it out. There's a number of other quotes you could draw from people like Friedrich Nietzsche and others to the same point. But we see even beyond just writing, even beyond artistic imitation, we see Homer directly influence culture. He is arguably, the story of the Iliad is a unifying story of Greece, because it gives but prior to the Iliad, Greece was not one country. Even after Homer, he kind of wasn't. Athens and Sparta were competing city-states, and there were others too. But the Iliad gave all of these different nations, essentially, all of these different independent states, a common place within a story, and it laid the groundwork for a single nationality. So, in a sense, the Iliad eventually unified Greece through story. It influenced Socrates tremendously, and in fact, if you read Plato's Apology, you'll see not only Socrates referencing the Iliad, but compare himself directly to Achilles as a hero in an interesting way. It was inspiring to Socrates, and Socrates in turn was the spiritual origin of science and what we would call liberalism, this skeptical, everyman approach to understanding our world. So there's sort of an indirect trajectory there. Alexander the Great, who conquered and eventually did militarily unify all of Greece from Macedon, famously, not only was he educated by Aristotle, who is Socrates' student, but he famously carried a copy of the Iliad with him everywhere he went. He wanted to be Achilles in many ways, and arguably achieved it. Alexander the Great was, mathematically, almost certainly the greatest general to ever live. Again, directly influenced by the Iliad, interestingly enough. And it had a tremendous effect on the Greek language. Now, the Greek that we see in the Iliad is not a Greek that was ever spoken anywhere. It was written down from one language, but slightly translated to another version of Greek, but not completely translated. It was only about 80 to 90% translated because they needed to keep the length of the poetic lines correct. They needed the right number of syllables to fill in the dactylic hexameter, which we will be going over shortly. So it was only partially translated to Ionian from, I forget the origin off the top of my head, but we end up with a form of Greek that no one ever spoke, but which tremendously influenced Greek, later Greek, and also English later on. It had a tremendous influence in Europe. Like I said in the previous video, not even so much Achilles, but Hector became a very prominent figure in European, in the ideal of European chivalry. And arguably, the story of the Iliad is the intellectual seed from which the tree of chivalry and the knighthood of Europe grew. We'll talk about the 9 worthies later on in the video. These were the 9 models for a knight that a knight was expected to emulate and draw inspiration from. There was 3 pagans, 3 Jews, and 3 Christians. But on the list of pagans, Alexander the Great was second. The first is, if you've been following along, guessed correctly, Hector. And, of course, there are cultural institutions like the Olympic Games. Now, the Olympic Games is based on a different hero. It is we will see in the Iliad funeral games held in honor of Patroclus. And there were similar funeral games held in honor of Achilles called the Panathenaic Games. Now, the Olympic Games are very similar to the Panathenaic Games. They're not exactly the same. It's for a different hero named Pelops. But these funeral games that we do every year or every 2 years or every 4 years to keep the memory of this hero alive in compensation for their sacrifice is an institution that we inherited from this time and was arguably kept alive by this story and kept going by this story. And also we see some profound religious ideas from the Iliad influence modern culture, especially Christianity. We'll be going into that probably not too much, so I'll just lay out the ideas here. If you go through Dr. Greg Naj's book here, he describes what makes an ancient Greek hero, of which Achilles is normally held to be the penultimate example. He has all of these features. He is untimely. He suffers tremendously. He is the ideal bridegroom in many ways. And there are all of these different features that none of the heroes have all of, but all of them have some of these features, and you get a kind of constellation of what heroism meant to the ancient Greeks. And a lot of this came from the Iliad itself. But what we see in Christianity is taking this ideal of heroism to a logical conclusion that even the Greeks didn't manage. Jesus is in many ways the perfect Greek hero, more so even than Achilles. And so there's some clear influence from the Iliad to Christianity, and I think that would explain why many Christians, including G.K. Chesterton, who we mentioned just a few minutes ago, had such fondness for the Iliad. So why study Homer? Aside from just the pleasure of seeing all these connections and the appreciation for the art, studying the classics can give you a tremendous amount of power and a tremendous amount of influence in the present. J.R.R. Tolkien famously was a Beowulf scholar, was a scholar of Old English, and fit many of these names. A familiarity with the language gave him power over the language of English to create these incredible stories that have a strange kind of compulsion. Things seem correct to us, even though we are not familiar with Beowulf or these other ancient Icelandic and Nordic sagas that J.R.R. Tolkien had familiarity with. But they are, in some sense, deep in our culture. These archetypes exist in the back of our minds, and if you understand these classical stories deeply, you can connect with them in other people. And another person besides J.R.R. Tolkien who did this phenomenally well was J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling is not just some, mom in England. Now, she was not a scholar to the degree that J.R.R. Tolkien was. J.R.R. Tolkien was a true academic. But J.K. Rowling did study French literature in particular in her college days, and went in quite a bit of depth there. And when you read Harry Potter, you can see a lot of that depth of she's not just making things up. There's a linguistic and mythical connection to stories that we are deeply familiar with, even without being familiar with them. And so for the Western world, as powerful as Beowulf is, and as powerful as the medieval French literature is, Homer is kind of the skeleton key. Homer is the archstone that holds everything else together. Or maybe better metaphor architecturally is, it is a foundation from which all of these other stories emerge. So if you can understand Homer, not only does it highlight all these connections, but it potentially, if you choose to take it this way, can give you that kind of power over language and over storytelling that you can employ to create great stories for the world. So that is, in my opinion, that are some of the important reasons to study Homer, to understand his influence on our culture, to which we come from, so to help us understand ourselves, and also to give us power to add to that in a way that is congruent and feels congruent to other people and will connect, and you can make beautiful things out of it. So thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next video.